gentlemen, please welcome U.S. Navy Commander, U.S. Cyber Command Director, NSA CSS, Admiral Michael S. Rogers.
Wish I'd set him up somehow.
Well, certainly an interesting panel to follow as the director of the National Security Agency. So, can you hear me all the way in the back? Can you raise your hand? Perfect. Good over there? Perfect, thanks. Well, hey, I want to start by thanking AMET, RSA, and the team for allowing me to spend a little time talking to you about cybersecurity, a topic that is at the heart of the teams that I'm a part of and a core aspect of our mission for both the National Security Agency and United States Cyber Command. And it's an honor to be here at RSA, the largest cybersecurity conference in the world. This year, I think it's approaching 35,000. That's a lot of people. Now, today's a big day. Who out here is a space kind of guy or woman? Way to go. Because in less than 12 hours, Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko will return from 340 days in space. Think about that. So I, too, am a space geek. Boy, I wish him a safe re-entry in about 12 hours. But we're brought together today by a broad common purpose, cybersecurity. And look at this audience and what it entails. You have people from industry here today. You have people here from academia. You have government. You have industry. You have technical individuals. You have those who generate products or services. You have those who do policy in the government. I think that this is a microcosm of the broader team and the broader set of partnerships that we have got to bring together if we're going to address the increasingly complex nature of the cyber threat that we're dealing with. This is not going to get better anytime soon. And it's going to require all of us to really do some hard, innovative work, because there's a lot of adversaries out there and their behavior continues to change. So what I'd like to do is start by talking a little bit about, so how do the two organizations that I'm responsible for, how do they fit into this cybersecurity framework, and what is it that they are doing? First, let me talk about United States Cyber Command. So it's a military organization with three primary missions. The first is to operate and defend the Department of Defense's networks. So, like many of you, I'm accountable for ensuring the security, partnering with others, of our networks, our weapon systems, and our platforms against cyber threats. Second mission for Cyber Command is to generate, partnering with the services in the acquisition world within the Department of Defense, to generate that dedicated workforce, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that's going to apply those cyber capabilities that we're developing within the department from the defensive to the offensive. And lastly, the third mission, which also has a big cybersecurity aspect to it, if directed by the President or the Secretary of Defense, to apply our capabilities to help defend critical U.S. infrastructure. As I think many of you are aware, the federal government has designated 16 segments within the private sector as having significant implications for our nation's security. Think about power, think about water, think about financial, think about aviation. There's 16 different segments. So three primary missions. And how are we going to go about within the Department of Defense and in partnering with critical infrastructure in the civil sector, how are we going to go about at U.S. Cyber Command helping to generate increased cybersecurity for the department? There's multiple aspects to that strategy. The first is we're going to spend a lot, and we are spending a lot of time going back to the fundamentals. How do you create a network in which defensibility, redundancy, and reliability are core design characteristics? Because for most of us in the world we're living in, the networks we're all trying to defend, the systems we're all trying to defend, many were built in a very different time and a place, when the idea of an external actor attempting to aggressively penetrate or gain access to those systems wasn't a primary concern, wasn't a primary design criteria. Clearly, the world we're living in now fundamentally different. So that's driving us to do things like the Joint Information Environment, the joint regional security stacks that we're creating that are designed to provide increased capability into our very structures for our networks. The second thing we're doing is looking at where and how we store data. If we could take anything away from OPM, from Anthem, data in itself is an increasing commodity of interest to many who have a strong desire to steal it. And we're spending a lot of time in the department mapping, so where are we holding data? What kind of tripwires, what kind of protocols have we put in place to ensure that that data is adequately defended? The third component of our strategy focuses on the human dimension, the workforce. There's multiple layers to that. The first part of it is the dedicated high-end cyber mission force that we are creating in the department. That's about 6,200 individuals that we will apply across the breadth of those 3 cyber missions that I talked to you about for Cyber Command, but doing it, building it from the ground up. We're about halfway through that build process right now. We have got to get it finished by September the 30th of 2018 is our goal. When I look at the data, and I review this every quarter, I just looked at the data about 2 weeks ago, we're right now postulating that if nothing changes, 93% of the force will be delivered on time. So I've got to figure out in the next 2 years how we're going to get that remaining 7% on time. Because the goal is 100% of those 6,200 individuals in 133 teams on station, fully trained, ready to operate in a very demanding environment, and to do that by 30 September 2018. We also have a nearer term interim goal, if you will, that we at least get to what we call initial operating capability for those 6,200 people. So even as we acknowledge we need more time to finish building the teams, given their full set of equipment and training them, such is the nature of the environment we're living in, that today, as soon as we can bring capability online, we are employing it. And so we are using the teams that were created, in some ways, to be honest, in ways they weren't originally intended. But it's our view, we need all the capacity we can get, and we can't wait for it to be perfect, if you will. And so the interim date we've set for ourselves for that kind of initial capability is that by 30 September 2016, just about 7 months from now, 8 months from now, that 100% of that force is going to be what we call IOC. When I looked at the data 2 weeks ago, we're currently 91% we're postulating. So I've got to figure out how do we get that remaining 9% back on track, if you will, get it back to deliver on time. And we're working our way through that. The other part when we think about workforce is not just that dedicated high-end cyber mission force, as we call it. Cyber is so foundational that every individual we've given access to a keyboard represents both a potential point of opportunity and a potential point of vulnerability. And you can have the greatest defensive scheme in the world, but you can't forget user behavior. And so part of our strategy about the workforce element is what's the kind of training, what do we need to ensure that every individual we're getting access to on that network understands the implications of the choices they make. Whether it's dealing with spear phishing emails, whether it's the choices they make and how at times they try to change their settings and their configurations to make things easier for them from their perspective, and what the broader implications are when we do that. The third component for us when it comes to workforce is how do you train and educate your leadership to understand, so what are the implications of this environment? What are the implications for us in a military context of how we operate in a world in which we're dealing with this kind of cyber threat? And you can't take that for granted. We spend a lot of time sitting down and working with our leadership about, so what does this environment mean? What are the implications for the future for them? So in addition to workforce, we're also looking at things like, how do we change our culture? I always tell people, look, technology is a fundamental aspect of this problem set, but it is not the end-all be-all. And don't ever forget the human dimension in this. And I find one of the biggest challenges is, how do you change culture? How do you create an environment where people understand the challenges that we're dealing with and what the implications are for them? How do you get into ideas like accountability and responsibility? In some ways, it's very much like the nuclear culture that I'm used to in the United States Navy as we brought nuclear power online in ships starting in the 1950s. And the culture that we have created over the last almost 60 years now, where the idea of accountability and responsibility and the risk that nuclear power poses, therefore the special processes, requirements, and culture that we've put in place to ensure that risk is mitigated and held to the absolute minimum, We need to do the same thing across the Department of Defense, and we're working our way through that journey. The next component of our strategy is how do we harness the power and the knowledge of the private sector? I believe the future is all about partnerships and it's all about integration. It is one reason why I'm here today with all of you. I believe in what you bring to this fight. I believe in the knowledge and the innovation that you help power. We are not going to solve this within the government and within the Department of Defense specifically. It's the power of partnerships and our ability to work together that I believe are going to generate the best outcomes for the department, for the nation, and I hope for all of you. One of the first steps in that journey of partnerships for us at Cyber Command is what we call the point of partnership, a small presence that we've created here in the Valley, partnering with the Defense Innovation and Experimentation Unit to try to see, is there a way that we can structure a small organization that is knowledgeable in life out here, because in fact we're using largely reservists who work in the tech sector to do this. I did not want a lot of people who had no experience in the ecosystem out here. I said, how can we find a means to bridge the differences in perspective and the lack of knowledge and insight that at times we each have about the other? And so that point of partnership has been in place now for coming up on about 6 months. Is working its way forward about how can we bring U.S. Cyber Command to the Valley and how can we bring the Valley to U.S. Cyber Command? And how can we do it in a way that generates value for both? Because if we can't generate value for both, that's not a partnership. Then it becomes a transaction. And I'm interested in moving beyond transactions and seeing what we can do to get to partnerships. We're doing things in the Valley out here, for example, like building relationships with Stanford, with Berkeley, with academic institutions around the United States, Carnegie Mellon and others. Because I believe that the academic perspective, research, and the insights that they can develop are also important for us. And I know many of you are doing the exact same thing. We're also doing things like exercises. My military culture teaches me that you try to exercise or simulate all the situations you're going to run into before you really get into a crisis. We call that training, we call that exercises. That's what my culture teaches me, as you try to exercise and simulate the environment you think you're going to have to deal with, the cyber threats, the challenges, the partnerships that we're going to need to deal with. And you want to do that before the crisis. So if U.S. Cyber Command is tasked to execute its mission to provide support to the defense of critical infrastructure in the United States in the face of advanced threats, the first time to do that is not in the middle of an attack. We need to do that on a regular basis. I encourage industry, I encourage all of you and your organizations, we want to partner. And if you're interested in being involved in some of those exercises, we welcome your participation. In fact, there's going to be one later today with a broader set out here within the subset of RSA. And I really welcome your guys' involvement in that. So that's a little bit about Cyber Command, about what our mission set is, how we're structured to deal with these cyber threats, and what's our way forward. Now, NSA, my other job, also has a significant information assurance or cyber defense mission set. NSA, two primary missions. The first, foreign intelligence. We harness the power of signals intelligence to generate insights as to what nation states, groups, and actors are doing that is of threat or concern to our citizens, our nation, and those of our friends and allies around the world. The other mission set for NSA is information assurance. As you heard in the discussion about cryptography, we have been a partner in the development of cryptographic standards both across the United States, internationally. We use those same standards in DoD systems, in the protection of our own systems. That's always been part of our history. That mission set continues to grow for us. We're moving from a focus beyond DoD because we are a part of the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency, and we're moving beyond DoD, focusing across the government and increasingly with the private sector. If you had told me that in my career I would be dealing with a motion picture company, for example, in my role as the National Security Agency, in the aftermath of the hack against Sony, it was nothing I ever anticipated, it was nothing I ever thought about. And yet, It's the nature of the world we find ourselves in, and I see that only developing further. NSA has some amazing defensive capabilities, I think, that we want to partner and share with others. Because the job for us is generating value, and that value is defined by others, not by us. And so we look forward to how we keep moving forward there. As we look at that information assurance mission, that, as I said, is increasingly driving us to partner more and more with the private sector. Again, it's another reason why I find myself out here. We're able to build on that knowledge we have of the threat, who the actors are, what their strategy is, what's the targets they're going after, how are they going after those targets, what are the vulnerabilities they're going to exploit. And the other sweet spot for us is our knowledge about, so how do you mitigate those vulnerabilities, how do you overcome them? And we spend a lot of time focused on that, and that's a growth area for us. It's because of the world around us and the challenges we see that NSA has literally spent the last year stepping back and asking itself, so what does the world of 2025 look like? What is the nature of the dynamic, technology, threat, the ability to generate a workforce with a budget set that we think is not going to be growing? It's been declining over the last few years, and I don't see budgets growing significantly in the future. So given that broad environment, how are we going to position ourselves for continued success in the future? And we picked 2025 as a framework. We said to ourselves, let's think about 10 years from now. Out of that effort in the last year has come this idea of NSA 21, which some of you have heard a little bit about in the media. But it was our desire to step back and say, given that mission of foreign intelligence and information assurance, what do we do to make sure that we can continue to provide the same level of excellence and capability today, 10 years from now? That's led us to several conclusions. First is the idea of three core tenets. And NSA 21 is designed to help us move out in these three core tenets. It's the power of people, number one, that we got to spend a lot of more time focused on how do you develop that workforce of the future? And how do you make it an agile and changing one that's capable of responding to a world that continually changes? The second tenet or component for us is the necessity of integration and partnership. I have always believed that. But as a team, we came to the conclusion that we got to step back and ask ourselves how we inculcate this idea of partnership and integration in a very formal, structured way. It's one of the reasons we've asked ourselves, so how can we take that knowledge on the offensive and the defensive piece in those two missions we have? And how can we use them both to generate better outcomes in both mission sets? It isn't one or the other for us at NSA. It's not all about foreign intelligence. It's not all about generating insights as to what nation states, groups, and actors are doing in terms of threat. It's also about how can we harness the knowledge and the insights that that mission generates to help improve our defensive capabilities as a nation. And what can we do to generate more insights to support all of us in our common journey? And that's what actually brings us all to RSA. This power of cybersecurity and the fact that we have got to continue to move forward here because the world around us is changing. And with those, and the final tenet is the benefit of innovation. The Valley's been there for a long time. As much as I love NSA, I am the first to acknowledge I am part of a large bureaucracy. And bureaucracy and innovation generally don't go together all that often. And one of the things we've said to ourselves is, hey, that third touchstone about the benefit of innovation, what do we got to do to step back and really inculcate that in our culture, in our processes, in our structures? And how do we incentivize that kind of behavior? And so that's the third kind of touchstone for NSA 21. And the last part of NSA 21 is what is the organizational construct that will generate those outcomes about the power of people, the benefit of integration and partnership, and the necessity of innovation, or the benefit of innovation. How can we create a structure that helps power those ideas? And so we've spent about a year working on this. We just addressed it publicly. We just rolled it out to the workforce the first week in February. We're going to take about the next 2 years to implement it because I'm the first to acknowledge it's a very significant set of changes for us, but we're doing it for one fundamental reason. The nation counts on us to generate insights to help ensure its security and safety, and to do it in a way that also addresses the privacy and the rights of our citizens. And I believe NSA 21 helps us do just that, and it optimizes us for a world in the future, and not just the world of the past. Because as a leader, I have always believed part of your job is to make sure that you're ahead of problem sets. Now, as I said, partnership is important. Let me share with you, if I could, a few thoughts, some takeaways for me. Because as I have said, both organizations heavily involved in the cybersecurity arena. I always remind people in an uncertain future, always ask yourself, so what are the fundamental tenets that you want to build your world around? And these are the fundamental tenets that I have come to believe that we need to keep in mind as we're moving forward in cybersecurity. The first is there is no silver bullet, no single answer. If you think a technology or technology alone is going to address this challenge set, I don't believe that. That is not my experience. I have yet to see that. I wish it was that simple. It would make all of our lives a whole lot easier, but I just don't see that. The next thing is technology alone isn't going to get us there. Don't ever forget the human dimension in all of this. It often gets overlooked to me. And that human dimension goes from how do you build a workforce that's agile and capable of working in this space, to how do you make sure your users are intelligent and smart and knowledgeable about the choices they make. But don't ever forget the human dimension in all of this. It's not about when you're going to be, or it's not about if you're going to be penetrated, it's about when you're going to be penetrated. And you need to spend a lot of time thinking about, so what are you going to do when that happens? And I spend a lot of time thinking about what are we going to do when that happens in the Department of Defense. Because while we're probably able to defeat 99% or plus of the actions that are directed against us, we have publicly acknowledged, hey, occasionally we fail. And we fail to stop them from getting in. Thank God it's a very small number of times, but we're very public about it when it does occur in a major way. And so much of our time is also spent about, so how are we going to keep operating as an organization? How are we going to keep achieving those mission outcomes? And we're no different than any of you. If you run a business, for example, you've got mission outcomes you've got to generate. And you've got to keep going. If you're Target, if you're Sony, fill in the blank. Business can't stop. You got to keep moving. You got to keep going ahead. So we spend a lot of time on that. Data increasingly has a value as a target. You see that, you saw that in OPM, you saw that in Anthem. I don't see that trend changing. It takes hard, sustained leadership and a commitment of time and resources to deal with the challenges of cybersecurity. It isn't enough to have a strong CIO or CISO team. That isn't going to get you where you need to be. And in DOD, I mean, I'm very blessed. We have a strong leadership team that believes in this, that is willing to invest in it, and that also believes we ought to be held accountable for what we do within the cybersecurity arena. I love a boss like that. I love an organization that's willing to embrace that challenge. And then the last comment I want to make, because I'm mindful of everyone's time, the challenge I see as I step back more broadly, and you saw it referenced in the last panel, the challenge that I see as we move forward is, how do we ensure the protection and the privacy of our rights as citizens, which is fundamental to our very construct as a nation? It's what drove the creation of this thing in the first place. We told those bastards in London nobody was going to tell us you could billet troops in anyone's home. You could unilaterally decide what we were going to say or what we were not going to say. And you couldn't tax us without us being part of that process. At the same time, we've also got to figure out how do we ensure the security and the safety of those same citizens. That is not an easy challenge in the world we're living in today. And how do we do it in a way that works not only within the United States, but globally? Because another aspect of this audience is many of you don't come from the United States. You reflect the increasingly interconnected world that we live in. And you are here in California, in the Valley, at a place that has been the heartbeat of innovation and fundamental change, that has helped to create a set of technologies that have ensured the greatest transfer of knowledge and insight we have probably ever experienced in the history of man. Think about how fortunate we are to live in that time, where access to knowledge and insight has never been so readily available, at the time and place of anyone's choosing, and in a format that they choose, and in a medium that they choose. That is an amazing positive for us as a nation and for us as a world. And yet we find ourselves now in a space where there are those who would want to use that same technology to harm others. And we got to figure out how we're going to meet those two imperatives, because it can't be one or the other. We got to figure out how we're going to do both. Now, I believe in the power of industry and what we have seen here in the Valley over the last decades to be part of that solution. We're spending a lot of time right now talking to each other about what we can't do. And in many ways, we're not even talking to each other. We're just talking past each other. And that sequence will play itself out. But as I look at the future, I say to myself, we have got to get to a dialogue. And we have got to figure out how we're going to do this. And that dialogue shouldn't be the government unilaterally deciding what we're going to do, industry unilaterally deciding what we ought to do. It's the power of us to come together and to tee up to our citizens. This is what's within the realm of the possible. Because these issues are so fundamental and so important to us as a nation that I believe our citizens need to be the ones saying, hey, this is what we're comfortable with and this is what we are not comfortable with. This is acceptable to us and this is not. And there is no solution without risk. I acknowledge that. It's all about how can we try to minimize that risk to a somewhat acceptable level, and how can we be honest and upfront with each other about that risk. And I implore all of us to be part of that constructive dialogue. It's time for us to all stop talking past each other and start figuring out how can we talk together and work together to figure out how we're going to meet those two incredibly critical imperatives. And it's not the one or the other. And you see that playing out in this broader cybersecurity dynamic right now that we're all a part of. But the power of partnership, innovation, and our ability to bring together the government and the private sector, I think is going to be at the heart of how we move forward. And as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of the National Security Agency, I and the teams that I'm a part of are dedicated to being part of those solutions. And we want to operate in a broad partnership and not in some sort of vacuum when we're back on the East Coast and we're just sitting there saying to you, trust us, we're just about national security. We are about national security. That's our mission set. But everything we do must comply with law and must be mindful that we do it in the defense of our citizens and we remain accountable to those citizens for what we do. Cybersecurity represents a whole lot of challenge. It's getting tougher, not easier. When I look out at the future, three things concern me when I look out for the next few years, because oftentimes I'll get asked, so, hey, Rogers, what is it that keeps you awake? And my smart-ass immediate answer is, trust me, with the work level, I have no problem sleeping. But the longer-term answer is, there's three things that I think about right now. The first is, it is only a matter of the when, not the if, you are going to see a nation state, a group or actor engage in destructive behavior against critical infrastructure in the United States. On the 23rd of December, 7 weeks ago, an actor penetrated the Ukrainian power grid and brought large segments of it offline in a very well-crafted attack that both focused on knocking the system down, but also focused on how was the provider likely to respond to that outage. And their strategy also addressed how they could attempt to slow down the restoration process. 7 weeks ago, it was the Ukraine. That isn't the last we're going to see of this. And that worries me. The second thing that concerns me is much of what we've seen in cyber to date has been about data theft. The theft of intellectual property, the removal of data. What happens when that same activity is used to manipulate data or manipulate software or products? And suddenly we can no longer trust the data we're visually seeing. As a military guy, I'm used to seeing visual presentations of the world around me very quickly using colors and symbology and geography so we can start to make risk-based decisions very quickly. What do you do when you can't believe that? What are we going to do as a society if you log out of your bank account and the numbers don't match what you think is reality? What do you do if you're a business and the financial transactions you've created that you're seeing don't reflect what you believe reality is? And the third and final area that concerns me is, to date, most non-state actors have viewed cyber as a tool to recruit, to spread ideology, to generate revenue, to coordinate widely dispersed individuals. What happens when some of those same actors use cyber as a tool for destruction? Because they're not interested in maintaining the status quo. They are interested in tearing that status quo down. So it's those three things that I tend to look at over the course of the next couple of years. With that, I'm very mindful of your time, and I want to keep things moving. Let me conclude by where I started. Thank you for taking the time today to be here. I want to thank Scott and Mikhail as they prepare to re-enter orbit. But think about that. Let me leave you with that thought. It took an international effort, a sustained effort, to address an incredibly complex set of problems to ensure that they could safely remain on orbit for 340 days. And yet we were able to do that. And I believe that we can address many of these challenges we're facing right now. But to do it, we got to come together. And I look forward to being part of that effort. With that, I thank you all very, very much for your time. Thank you, ma'am.